All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. One thing I love about this summit is that they don't read off that bloviating bio before you speak and go on and on about all of the things that you hate to hear about yourself and cringe. So I'm Chris Danley, this is Don Kostelec, and together we are Vitruvian Planning. And we have a lot of familiar faces in the room. And thank you for attending us, this session, and we really do appreciate it. For the next close to an hour, we really want to try to clarify and clean up some misconceptions about what the heck Vision Zero is and certainly what it is not. And there's a lot of things out there that are not Vision Zero, and unfortunately fewer that are. So let's get into it. The science-based approach to preventing death and serious injuries. Welcome to our state. We see signs like this, unfortunately, all over our good state, right? And it's kind of our philosophy that if we resort to, general citizens having to do things like this, we've got a problem, right? And unfortunately, we see this over and over and over again. But this is kind of example one of people begging for something to be done to the streets in which they live to slow traffic down, make it safer. Whether there's some sort of a specific example why or not, it's perception, and perception matters. But it also is critical to our general safety. So where we're going to start with is let somebody else kind of explain a little bit of science. We like science, and we're going to use it. So for the next minute or two,
Newton was a pretty brilliant guy. The laws of motion he advanced over 300 years ago are still used today to explain the dynamics of modern day events like car crashes. But even Newton failed to recognize the existence of energy. Even though it's all around us, energy is tough to conceptualize. Scientists have had difficulty defining energy because it exists in so many different forms. It's usually defined as the ability to do work, or as one of my students says, it's the stuff that makes things move. Energy comes in many forms. There's radiant, electrical, chemical, thermal, and nuclear energy. In relating the concept of energy to car crashes, though, we are mostly concerned with motion-related energy, kinetic energy. Moving objects have kinetic energy. A baseball thrown to a batter. A diver heading toward the water. An airplane flying through the sky. A car traveling down the highway. All have kinetic energy. But energy doesn't have to involve motion. An object can have stored energy due to its position or its condition. This is a device that delivers a force to a crash dummy's chest to test the stiffness of the ribs. The force is a result of the kinetic energy being transferred from the pendulum to the dummy's chest. As the pendulum sits at its ready position, its potential energy is equal to its kinetic energy at impact. When it is released and begins traveling towards the dummy's chest, the potential energy transforms into kinetic energy. If we freeze the pendulum halfway, what is its potential versus kinetic energy? They are equal. When has the pendulum reached its maximum kinetic energy? Here, at the bottom of its swing. The amount of kinetic energy an object has depends upon its mass and velocity. The greater the mass, the greater the kinetic energy. The greater the velocity, the greater the kinetic energy. The formula that we use to calculate kinetic energy looks like this. Ke, that's kinetic energy, equals 1/2 mv squared. That's the velocity multiplied by itself. And if you do the math, you'll see why speed is such a critical factor in the outcome of a car collision. The kinetic energy is proportional to the square of the speed. So if we double the speed, we quadruple the amount of energy in a car collision.
Did you catch that last part?
Say it again.
There's a quiz later on. You'll have to have that formula memorized, right? If we double the speed of a vehicle, we quadruple its energy transfer. So from 5 to 10 miles an hour, we're quadrupling the energy. From 10 to 20, another quadrupling, 20 to 40, etc. That energy transfer is what kills us. That is what's so deadly for not only other vehicle drivers, but also as pedestrians and bicyclists. We need you to understand this in order to be able to move forward and better understand what Vision Zero is all about. So, we've been doing things a certain way for a good number of years, and it's important to know and to note that there's a lot of really good people who are out there trying their best, right, to make it safer for everything and everybody on our roads. And we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that and just kind of throw a bunch of negativity out there. It's easy to do that, but we've made some good strides. It's just that we can be doing better. And in other places around the globe, they've gone a different way and used the abnormal brain, so to speak, to get at those safety measures that we're going to be talking about today. In the health profession, they do things with their abnormal brain, right, Angie? We think about making influence and how do we get change? Well, they used to give out water bottles individually at health fairs. That was an example of individuality, of a specific individual interaction. Take this water bottle, put water in it, be hydrated, therefore you're healthy. One person, maybe. Systems change. You all heard about last year in the legislature, there was an effort to basically increase tobacco sales not from 18 but to 21. That's a system change, right? We're not talking about not giving one person one cigarette. It's, in this case, denying access until the age of 21. Why? Because the evidence shows that virtually every smoker started in that time frame between 18 and 21. So if we can get past that age, in all likelihood, someone will likely never, ever light up a cigarette. Number 2 cancer, or number 2 killer in the state, cancer. There's your system change. That's what Vision Zero is trying to get to, systems change. We know that this has worked because, again, going back to the health profession and thinking about that tobacco 21, for the last 50, 60 years, there's been a significant effort to do that very thing. We used to see sitcoms, I Love Lucy, right? Smoking in the bed. You don't see that. You don't see advertisement on television. You think about the no smoking policies and secondhand smoke, all of the different things that have gone upstream, so to speak, to make a difference. And that's, again, what we're trying to get to with Vision Zero. The National Traffic Safety Board, many of you have heard that. Most of the time you hear it when something like this unfortunately happens. They're the first on the scene to do the investigation. They released a pretty seminal report about a year ago on speed, on speeding particularly, and how it has affected us as Americans. I need you to understand this. There is a very significant difference between speeding and speed. Okay? What is speeding? Anybody an attorney? Anybody ever had an attorney? Okay, speeding is a legal term, right? Speed is a scientific term. If you are struck by me driving at 40 miles an hour and the posted speed is 40 miles an hour, I'm not speeding. But speed will kill you, right? See the difference? That's the important aspect of this and why we need to get to a more systematic improvement throughout our country. You probably have already seen some of this or heard reference to it, but we're now starting to lose the battle a bit. We've made significant ground. From its peak, and I have on my desk in my office a Life magazine from 1972 that I happened to see in an antique store a couple months ago, whose headline and the whole front cover was like Deadly Highways. From about that same time when we peaked out in it was about 72, just off that chart, of about 55,000 people per year were being killed. All right, now we've actually gone down pretty significantly, and especially as population has increased. But the last several years, we're going backward. We're going in the wrong direction. And the biggest group who's taking it on the chin are us as walkers and bicyclists, okay? That's the biggest percent change that we're seeing. We're now at 6,000 people who are walking, and the biggest change overall compared to vehicles, transit, etc., who are part of this formula. Yes, sir?
Are you saying the peaks in the 70s were car-to-car crashes?
No, it's total. So in other words, in the early 1970s, all total deaths throughout the entire transportation system peaked out at about 50, I think it was about 55,000 total deaths. And since then, we have kind of gone down, up, but overall kind of trending down. But in the last few years, we're going up.
But the uptick is in pedestrian.
The biggest uptick in the last couple of years has been pedestrians specifically. I think it's a 12% or 14% increase in the last couple of years for pedestrians as a part of that share. So yes, they're the biggest chunk that's rising.
Compared to the 70s, it was.
Well, overall in the 70s, we're pretty similar to where we were pedestrian-wise. So yeah, but we're still, like I said, on the uptick, despite all of the things that we've tried to do on the safety front for the last 40 years. Here's an example of how you see this, right? Here's how you see it's planned out, or plays out. The image of a child, right? 20 versus 30. That's not speeding, that's speed, right? This is how it affects us as we're walking or driving. If you're a belted driver, it doesn't matter if I'm speeding. It's speed. I'm going to keep hitting that on the head. If I'm doing 40 miles an hour on buckle, I have a 17% chance of death. But just 10 miles an hour faster, that puts me at 60. For a pedestrian, it's virtual certainty. Okay, again, speed versus speeding. That NTSB report is again important because it highlights a lot of the things that I'm talking about and what it has done for us as walkers, bikers, and so forth. So how do we determine speed? How do we determine posted speed on our roads? Many of you know this, but those of you who do not, it goes all the way back, and there's in that report, to what's called this 85th percentile rule. It, in essence, came out of one study. And I think it was 1952. It was of a rural roadway study. And what they basically said was, out of 85% of overall traffic, they're generally going about the same speed within sort of this curve, so to speak. That last 15%, that's where they were saying it was the most hazardous. So whenever we determine that, we also end up taking our posted speed and equalizing what is reported on that 85th percentile. We've been using that for generations, okay? It's been described as the rule of thumb, but guess what? It's not in documents like MUTCD. It's not in Institute of Traffic Engineers guidance. It was from one recommendation many, many, many years ago, and in fact, the report says on the very bottom, you see, dated research and may not be valid under scrutiny. That's what they're saying. Traffic Safety Board and National Traffic Safety Board saying that. They're also saying that there's no evidence that it equates to the speed with the lowest crash involvement. It's just you running the asylum, so to speak. In other words, we're leaving it to you, the driver, to determine what's comfortable. And whenever we study that and you determine how fast it is, we'll make it that way. That's the opposite of what Vision Zero would tell and say. It'd say, what do we want it to be? What are the conditions? How many folks do we have walking? What's the land use context? And on. As we get into this, you'll see. What are some of those spillover effects from that 85th percentile? What does that mean? We just last session have continued to talk about increasing here in the state our speed limits out on the interstates, right? In the 60s or 70s, what was it? 55 in the name of conservation, right? Then it was 65, then it was 75. Now we're up to 80. And Don and I can attest, because Lord knows we've driven down to Salt Lake enough times, where if you're down on Interstate 80, we could be doing 80, and guess what? I'll see a Utah driver going 90. This is that spillover effect that we're talking about. That same report said that in California, when they raised that, there was a spillover effect to the local system nearby 2 hours away. Even though you were no longer posted at 65 and back down to 55, we still saw that increase. Same thing with Utah. When they raised it from 75 to 80, right, the 85th percentile moved up. Again, it moved up. So in other words, we're chasing our tail. Every time we say it's going to be this and we raise that up, we as drivers ultimately go a little bit faster, and it's becoming more and more deadly. Ultimately, this is kind of what it concluded, unintended consequences. Higher operating speeds basically just meant more and more speed zones outside of those general areas. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don, and he'll start to crack the egg a little bit on what's being done in Sweden.
So where Vision Zero emerged was in the early 70s. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's for them.
The camera, sorry.
All right. When we look at our fatality rates as a population in the 70s, countries like Sweden and the Netherlands were at very similar fatality rates as we were. And we've all declined. But where Chris showed we had 44,000 deaths last year, or up close to 40, had we adopted the same design standards that Sweden and the Netherlands did in the 1970s, we would be at 20,000 deaths a year. That's kind of what the academic research has shown. And so we were all on similar paths at that time. And the Swedish one was really based on what's called a safe systems approach. As Chris said, set the speed to the likely crash types and resulting impact forces. One of the things with that 85th percentile study from the 50s was our average operating speeds were lower. And our distractions in our vehicles were lower. What could you do in a car in 1955? You had 4 stations you could get on the radio, and we didn't even have fast food restaurants with drive-thrus versus today. And so where we think this starts to fall apart is the human body can only take so much force. So if we're basing our speed limits on something that was done when our distractions and other things were much less, and now we're saying, well, it's still okay to go 85 miles an hour, we've missed a component of that. And enter the safe system stuff. One of the things we hear of like, well, speed limits in Europe are just as high. Yeah, they are. But they also have a safe systems approach. Your responsibility legally as a driver is much greater in those countries. So the results of a mistake weigh on your mind. In the Netherlands, the driver is assumed at fault first in a bicyclist and a pedestrian crash. And we even saw something yesterday on the Boise bike lanes thing that a motorist sideswiped a bicyclist and the police were clearly standing on the side of the motorist in the testimony. They also have speed cameras all along freeways in better parts of Europe. Safe systems approach. And this piece at the bottom, crash prevention resides not only with drivers, but also with the stakeholders of the road system. One of the biggest false statistics we see reported is that 94% of crashes are due to driver error. And I was hoping to get the dialogue. I've been exchanging messages with the General Counsel of a European road safety organization who's getting me the information of why that assumption is false. And we'll get to that. How the road is designed and how the speed limit is set both play a role in crash prevention. So moving that conventional design. And a lot of things people say will be like, well, we're not Sweden. Well, no, in the 1970s, they weren't either. And they've changed that paradigm and are getting to this. And so when you hear the Vision Zero component, that's what we're starting to talk about, is emulate some of the things that they are doing. And so here's kind of their guidance on possible maximum travel speeds. Location with conflicts between pedestrians and cars, 30 kilometers or 19 miles an hour. We talk about Utah. In the up to the 1940s, Utah had state laws that basically said the speed limit shall not be higher in a business district, a residential area, than 20 miles an hour. And they based it on land uses. That's what they were basing those things on. Roads with no possibility of a side impact or frontal impact, only impact with infrastructure, possible travel speed 62 miles an hour. That's our interstate highways, where the concept of a forgiving road really starts to come into play because we're making mistakes within our own path. We're not as much in conflict with opposite direction travel and not in contact with vulnerable road users. And so this is the philosophy behind Vision Zero. First, the designers of the system are responsible for the design, operation, and use of the system. Second, road users are responsible for following the rules of the transportation system. And finally, when we as humans inevitably fail, because we're human, we must go back and take the necessary steps as designers to correct those things. And that's where I think we find the fallacy of just saying, well, it's 94% driver error. We've done everything we could in the road. And the successful countries at this have said, no, we're looking at that a little bit differently. So this is where we take the traditional approach versus Vision Zero and compare it. We, for a long time in this country, have said traffic deaths are inevitable. It's kind of been our solution. Let's do educational campaigns and tell people to act better because we want to perfect human behavior. We want to prevent collisions, and I'll explain that in a minute. We place the responsibility on individuals, and we take the approach that saving lives is expensive. So many times we only respond and correct things when somebody dies instead of doing the Netherlands approach and identifying the circumstances in which people die and correcting the existing places where those circumstances may exist. So Vision Zero, we say traffic deaths are preventable. We have to integrate human failing into the design of the road, and that all goes back to managing speed. We want to prevent fatal and severe crashes. Too many times I've been involved in state DOT studies and others where they say, well, we're doing this for safety. And what they're really talking about is we're reducing motorist inconvenience crashes, fender benders, mirror dings, and things like that. And we spend a lot of money doing that and tend to sometimes, I remember a statement from a traffic engineer working, well, fatality is just one crash versus all the others. And so again, we're taking a different paradigm, a systems approach, like I said, and the philosophy that saving lives is not expensive. This is Infrastructure Week in America, again, as we talk about a transportation bill, and it surprises me all of the times that safety is used as a reason to increase funding, when to me it's really to kind of do other things. And we use safety and potholes, I think, as a reason for increased funding to then kind of follow the status quo. This is kind of what transportation safety culture has been, and this is kind of a common paradigm in safety culture, but first we kind of have a resistant culture, and I think we're getting beyond that a little bit, but then we have a reactive culture, safety campaigns. It's up to you. Then we kind of get into a management culture. Well, we can manage this and mitigate it a little, but yeah, we're the government. We can only do so much. And then transitioning into an ownership culture and making it a way of life. And getting to the top steps of that and evolving is really what Vision Zero is about. And really, as much as we talk about some of the engineering, some of this is just as political. I think if you were to probably in their hearts ask ITD and others when the state said to raise speed limits, they were probably sitting there going, no. But the political pressure is so great. We know that things like medians and access control have significant positive impacts on preventing deaths. But can we get them? No, because businesses are tapping people on the shoulders and it's political influence. So it does rest there at that cultural level. If we look at Idaho, $4.3 billion was the estimated cost of crashes in 2016. That's based on ITD figures coming down from National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. When we look at the bulk of those costs, our societal cost exists up at the top realm of fatalities, a significant portion of those. And then as you see, serious injuries are also a significant cost, but they drop off dramatically. In the bicyclist and pedestrian realm, bicyclists are less than 1% of total bicyclists and pedestrians are less than 1% of total trips in the state, but they account for 7.7% of our statewide total crashes. And as I presented this morning, just this week, finished up the analysis of 20-year crash data, and I think it's where we're seeing Vision Zero play out of why it's needed. Only 13% of Idaho's roads are managed by ITD, but 42% of the state's pedestrian fatalities occur on ITD-managed roads. Why? Higher speeds, more gaps, bigger gaps in crosswalks, and all these other things that start to play a role. And that's not to pick on them as an agency. I've seen those same trends in other states. When I was in North Carolina, we had a similar offset in some of those things. So let's be honest a bit. This is kind of our typical cross-section that many of us today would say, hey, we adopted a complete streets policy. We've included bike lanes and we've included sidewalks, but we've kind of applied some rural or suburban interstate thinking to that forgiving road concept on the driver's side. And so, and this is coming out of the Vision Zero stuff in Portland, when they look at our traditional streets that we've been designing maybe for the last 20 years, how do we repurpose that space and think about it? We look at lighting. We look at cameras, we look at medians, frequent and safer crosswalks, buffered bike lanes, and things like that are how we start to introduce that into there. But you can already see from a political standpoint how these things could be tough, even to the most well-intentioned designers. We're starting to get to buffered and somewhat protected bike lanes here in Boise, but it's still a struggle in some ways. A lot of the stuff, too, is also driven by an interpretation of what's called AASHTO, or the AASHTO Green Book, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Every executive director of the 50 state DOTs sits on their board of directors, and their big 700-page manual, the Green Book, guides a lot of things. An important thing to remember, though, is that's just guidance. And unfortunately, sometimes it gets interpreted too much as standard. And a book I use a lot is their Guide to Flexibility and Highway Design. That, to me, has the engineering foundation of what's here. The AASHTO Green Book is not intended, and never was intended, to be used solely as a standard upon which to base the design of every highway improvement. Sufficient flexibility is permitted to encourage independent designs tailored to particular situations. And so why, when designing a road for downtown Boise, should we use the same design standard for rural Meridian or other places? That's what we're getting at. We need to contextualize and look at these things. One of the myths that's in there is lane widths for vehicles. So many times we've been in discussion, we can't have lane widths less than 12 feet. Maybe we'll go to 11, but that's about it. AASHTO, the normal range is 9 to 12 feet, 10 to 12 for urban arterials, and the value for lower speed urban street lane widths are less rigorously devised. And so our default position of that is really not based on what AASHTO is saying is a hard and fast rule. Less direct evidence of safety benefit associated with incrementally wider lanes in urban areas. And I'll give ITD credit. This is Highway 55 in McCall, restriped with 10-foot travel lanes and showing recreational vehicles and the heavy traffic that goes through there working in that type of lane width. It's not just lane width, it is other road features, but that is a start in it. Crash types I mentioned in terms of focusing on kinetic energy and looking at severe and injury crashes versus all. And an example where we have that are roundabouts. Roundabouts are all about controlling the speed at the entrance to the roundabout, and we'll give some examples later that they have almost eliminated fatal and severe crashes. We heard that from the police department in Caldwell when we did this workshop. They said, my God, it's eliminated all of our responses to those intersections that we used to have, and us as traffic safety officers can go do our job in other places. They tend to work. So when we look at that redesigning the street, we have some examples. Here, anybody know where this is? What is it? Bound Crossing, built about a decade ago in southeast Boise. This was a section line road in the long range planning that, kind of going by these typical standards, said, well, no, it's going to be a 5-lane road. It's a section line road. Developers came in and said, whoa, we got a different vision for it. And it was a struggle. I was working at the highway district and we were evaluating this and dealing with this, and it was hard from the city's zoning perspective, and Chris will talk about how land use influences this, and it was hard from our traffic perspective. But when we look back at these features of a road and we look at what Bound has, it has many of them. More marked crosswalks. It's almost an urban grid that's built there. Shorter crossing distance at crosswalks. We have curb extensions or bulb outs at that main intersection. We have a raised median. We have more street lights. We have complete sidewalks with the gaps filled, and in most cases they are buffered or extra wide in some ways. We have no buffered bike lanes. That was not in our design vernacular at the time. And we don't have speed safety cameras for some other obvious reasons. And this one is probably on the cusp of a place where we might want to do a buffered bike lane today. I think if we did it in a preferred sense, maybe we put it to the back of traffic, or because of the connections to the green belt, we might put those bike lanes up at the curb level. But we didn't have that to guide us as much at the time. And we've got a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit that, when I look at the design set based on a desired speed, this has many of those visible features of street friction and lane widths and land use massing that helps naturally enforce the design of that road. We'll get to another part of this, and I want you to look at these next 4 slides. This is a 55-mile-an-hour road. This is a 45-mile-an-hour road. This is a 35-mile-an-hour road. This is a 25-mile-an-hour section of that road. What's the difference in the design? A sign. Except up here, we've protected the light poles with guardrails. Probably because of the embankment that goes off there. But we see this a lot. 4 different speed expectations on the same design of the road. If I'm a police officer, I'm going, God help me, please. I can't enforce this. And what if you were to say, hey, parents, feel confident that your kids can cross this 55-mile-an-hour street at 25 miles an hour because we put a flasher out there? I'm not letting my daughter do that on a regular basis. We have this locally. This is Simplot Boulevard out in Caldwell. 35, 45, 55, exact same road. Now we're doing that because we're stepping down speed expectations, but we've done nothing else in the design of that road to get at that. And you know what we heard from Caldwell Police? It's our highest injury crash corridor, and we don't feel safe doing our job out there. We don't like pulling people over. We don't like patrolling it because of that. And then we made them walk those sidewalks with traffic to their back and then asked them how they felt. So some of the other things we get into that's political about this is things like level of service. And the good part is we're starting to myth bust here. A lot of things here, well, we have a level of service policy that says, you know, it's a federal standard. We can't slow vehicles, or we have a substandard design. False. The Green Book says failure to achieve a level of service indicated by the Green Book does not constitute a non-standard design decision. It is contextual, like we've said it should be in there. And Federal Highway Administration even issued a memo in 2016 that's saying level of service is merely guidance for the national highway system, and you should account other factors. This is Federal Highway Administration guidance on level of service for pedestrians. Ask about that in your next traffic study. And an interesting piece of that is at 40 seconds of delay, a high likelihood of non-compliance. Don't expect the pedestrians to obey the signals if you give them a high degree of delay. And at 60 seconds, we get to very high. Yet we've timed some signals that you're waiting there 3 minutes. And then we blame the pedestrians for going for it? Well, we know from the science that they're not going to do those kind of things. Here's that FHWA reference memo on that. There is no federal mandate for level of service, so we can't play that card. We do have local agencies here that have adopted stricter level of service policy based on that, but the good part of that is that's our local choice, and that's a lot easier to change, and FHWA is recognizing that. What we finally get down to is if we do all of that, we then give an opportunity for our traditional approaches of education and enforcement to work. Let's make sure we've designed the safest system possible before putting the onus on things like that. So this has the greatest impact for that last marginal bit that we also have to deal with in that. And with that, I'll let Chris take it from here.
For the sake of time, we're going to push through a little bit, make sure you guys have time for Q&A. As Don mentioned, and what we've hopefully conveyed to all of you, Vision Zero is mostly about design, right? It's mostly about changing how we go about designing roads. There is a component of education and enforcement. However, I will say most of the time, this is how it's been interpreted, as this being the fundamental to Vision Zero. We see this all the time. It's all about these education campaigns, and it's up to you, right? It's to do this and do that. Well, that's not what Vision Zero is. However, there is a place for such of these types of things. But we're really trying to reinforce good decision making, right, and educate where we can. But let me ask you a question. When was the last time you took a driver's exam? Are all of you familiar with the newest, greatest, how a hawk signal is supposed to work if you're not in the industry? Do you know how a 2-lane roundabout is supposed to work as a driver? Right? You never get questioned on that. You have your license. You've been blessed. Go forth and drive, right? We very, very rarely ever have an opportunity to learn about the very things that you're subjected to all of the time. And that's where we fall short. A commercial isn't going to teach you how a hawk signal works. We were laughing in one of the previous sessions saying that it was a sign that Peter was showing. We need that around here, right? Because, yeah, people, when a hawk signal starts to flash, or if it's red, they just zoom through. That's a lack of education. So anyway, we need this, but it's not something that we need to lean on. No texting, right? No calling. Don mentioned this earlier. Why are we seeing that uptick? We do know some of the answers. The distracted driving is a real issue. It's definitely a real issue. There's a report by IIHS that just came out last week that talked about some of those very features, that we are too darn distracted. You could darn near watch a movie in your vehicle now, right? Text, take pictures, whatever, anything but driving. But it's a real factor. Land use, I want to talk about this. We would be failing as a city if all we did was design the most perfect streets and never think about the land use side of this coin, okay? We need to be thinking about some of these connectivities. We need to be thinking about the severity of crashes when we have a good grid system versus more curvilinear roads. A grid system, the speeds are slower. So, what I tell you earlier, if the speeds are slower, therefore so too is the impact and the death rates and so forth. We need to be thinking about height and location of buildings. If we build the coolest, greatest street in all the world, but we set buildings way back from the road, you as a driver or other drivers have no prompts. You have nothing that, like we talked about earlier with the street friction aspect of things, to get you to slow down. Every one of you as a driver have probably been down a major highway that's 5-7 lanes and looked down at your speedometer and go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was going 50, right? If you go through Garden City, they're banking on it because the cops are ready for you, right? They're ready to give you a ticket. Why? That land massing, the vertical placement is not there. So, and neither is the design of the road, but that's the point. We have to get to this. Chris is back here from, you're back in Coeur d'Alene on Sherman Avenue, in what was named one of the top 10 streets in America, right? The best part of Sherman is what's top 10, and that looks like this with the 4-to-1 massing from the height to width. You go down the road a quarter mile, it completely changes, and so too does the context of streets. Or travel behavior. We open it up, it gets faster, and what's happened? Much more difficult for pedestrians to try to cross the road. It's a much bigger problem, and a big part of it is because of this. Here's the example. Here's downtown. Here's Sherman, right? If you've ever been to Coeur d'Alene, you know this. It's quaint, it's nice, it's great. Okay, 2 lanes, we have on-street parking, we have all the different friction, the vertical placement is done well. Short grids, or short block lengths too, by the way, so our pedestrians have an opportunity to cross the road with more frequency. We go down just a little bit, not even maybe, again, 1/8 of a mile, and things change dramatically. And now we see the setbacks, the big shopping centers back, the parking out in front, all of these things decline and diminish, rather, the effectiveness of the roadway and the safety, till we finally get out, and this isn't Sherman, but examples like this that is up that way, where one of the worst roads in all of the area, up in Spokane area, you see it's horrible. In 7 lanes, and now a corridor that people are desperate to try to do something else with. But it's important to get past this stuff. So I'm going to turn this to Don, and we'll talk a little bit about, so who has done this stuff and how much success have we had? Quickly, because I know we got to get Q&A.
So the good part is we're starting to trickle down a little bit from the major metros that are doing this, and getting places like a Columbia, Missouri, a Macon, Georgia, and places that are kind of more contextual to Idaho. But we'll start in New York City, because this was once called the Boulevard of Death. And New York City and San Francisco have kind of been the 2 major metros that have taken this design focus to Vision Zero to heart, and reconfigured the road within the existing space. And what you see from the crashes is both the actual and the percent of crashes went down. Total crashes down 28%, crashes with injuries down 29%, total injuries down 35%, and that's for all modes that it's there. So Vision Zero might sometimes be seen as just an active transportation benefit. No, it's there for drivers. Charlotte, North Carolina did several road diets starting about a decade ago. And when you look at the crash data that's here for cars, rear end, angle type, side swipe, head on, parked, and unrelated, they all went down except parked cars increased. Why? Well, there was not that much parking there before, so we would expect that. And the funny part with that was they did the road diets and traffic volumes went up. Traffic efficiency went up on that. And I think we always fear if we take a lane away from vehicles, we're going to have some Carmageddon. It didn't happen there. Roundabouts. Minnesota DOT, Wisconsin DOT are moving more exclusively to basically say you have to prove a roundabout won't work before we do a conventional signal. Roundabouts significantly reduce fatal accidents. And now they have more data to back up those claims. They found that minor property damage accidents became more frequent. Well, that's a fender bender, taking out a sign and some other things. That's not threatening somebody's life. And then some of the latest stuff, like I said, with New York, and that is starting to get some notice in there. So one last piece for Chris to kind of talk about the Idaho context and what this can mean for some of our places, and then we'll wrap it up.
Some of you've seen this. I like to show this all the time. This is Troy, Idaho. Okay? We do this all the time. We build roadways and we widen things out and we add more lanes. That roadway can handle about 20,000 vehicles per day. It gets 3,000 per day, right? We have an opportunity. That doesn't need to be 4 lanes wide. It can be 2 lanes wide. We can do a buffered bike lane, for example. Oh, by the way, that goes up against a really incredible trail that takes you all the way into Moscow, back and forth. And we have a missed opportunity. In fact, it actually ends right about here and goes behind the city, behind the town, behind all the businesses. And if you saw earlier with Russ, we know why we're missing that out. So we don't have the money. That's also, by the way, at 8 o'clock in the morning, rush hour traffic in Troy. And that's not kidding. That's what it looks like. So we have the money to do all of this stuff, right? Congestion ahead, yeah, all of this stuff. A couple of other little stories we've heard about what we're willing to do. Our kids are worth whatever it takes. Wow, that's quite a statement. Let's see if we follow that. And well, there's where that thing is tethered to. That road takes you to the school, the high school, middle school, everything, right? It's more of a rural context, but we've pretty much provided nothing in terms of any types of, not even paint to delineate a walk space. We've built a trail on the near side, which is what you see in the concrete, and the roadway in the middle, that's actually a state highway. That off to the right, upper right here, is the public health building. We can't even put in a crosswalk there. The request was made by the city, in this case to the DOT, to be perfectly honest with you, and we weren't going to do it because they said, oh, it doesn't meet warrants. Lovely, right? A trail that they put a lot of money into to capture the tourism, right, that we're hoping for, to get us to the school. Our kids are worth whatever it takes, except for that paint, except for a couple facilities to get us to something like that. Yes, ma'am. We have a quick question.
This is on Troy.
No, this is actually in Orofino, home of the Maniacs. They are not allowed to ride their bikes to school. That's a whole other topic because, yes, they moved the school from downtown up on a bluff. And one of the most cringeworthy things I've ever heard in my career was the mayor tell me, yeah, for 25 years no one's been able to ride their bike to school. That's what's happening in this state. Okay? A couple of other things and we'll wrap up. This is one up in Bonners Ferry. This is a push button state highway. One of the scariest places I've ever been in the 15 years I've been doing this. Logging trucks come right up along here. Do you think an intersection like that would meet Vision Zero in terms of, hey, this is our expectation of vehicle type, vehicle speed. We need to provide that extra space in order to get us across the road safely or provide that refuge. None of it's here. I'm going to blast through this, make sure you guys get some questions. We've been through some of this. Real quick on this, we say all the time, hey, use the nearest crosswalk, right? Okay, well, here's the separation, mile and almost a quarter. Yet if I'm trying to cross this road, what does that equivalent look like? If it's a straight line, if I had a good intersection system, good crossings, like we were just talking about, it'd take me about 4.5 minutes to get there. Instead, I got to do things like this, right? That's not what Vision Zero would be about. 21 driveways, all those conflicts, right? All of the things that we talked about, 3-minute wait time, level of service F for pedestrians in this particular instance. And we see this all the time. If we ask drivers to do the equivalent and said, nope, you're the one that's going to go a 20-minute route outside of your way, you see a 10-mile round trip to do that. We don't ask drivers to do that kind of thing all the time, but for pedestrians, we do it a lot. So we talked about quite a bit. With the few minutes that we do have left, we can have this type of a conversation on Vision Zero for days, to be honest, because there's a lot more detail to it. But the thing that I take away from it, it's not speeding, it's speed. It's kinetic energy and the transfer to you, the most vulnerable, because you don't have a body of armor wrapped around you, right? Anytime you try to cross a road, you're in harm's way. How can we make it safer? How can we redefine and redesign our roadways to make them safer? Vision Zero is a method to do that. And I would encourage you to do a little bit of research on your own. Read about it, go on YouTube, all the different things that are out there. So with that, questions. I see you have one.
You guys offer this as an opportunity. Like, can we get a copy of your slide?
I think all of them are going to be part of the, so.
The other question I have is, like, we are that community who have a 5-lane highway through town at 35 miles an hour.
Yep.
Rural Idaho, it's the Highway 30 through Idaho, which is a shortcut from Wyoming's Interstate to 15.
Mhm.
So we have 3,000 semis a day through our town. But there's a lot of pushback in the community, even against the discussion of reducing the speed limit. But then if you take a survey and a poll and ask the parents, how many of you will let your kids walk to school? Because we're divided by Highway 30 east to west, we're Highway 34 north to south, the Union Pacific main line east to west, and the Union Pacific spur line for the lines runs north. So we're literally like bisected to our community for all these major transportations. How do you get people to approach that? Because like people in the community won't even have the conversation about reducing the speed. Say like it's 35 because you can get here, but then none of them will let their kids walk to the park or walk if they live on the north side of town. There's no way that they're going to allow them to walk to the elementary school because they have to cross the train tracks and they have to cross Highway 30 and maybe 34 to even get to the elementary school. So I'm trying to find like resources that we can even begin having that conversation that makes people, instead of like, I'm not hearing anything you say, which is kind of the attitude now, to maybe we should entertain this conversation. Like, do you guys have resources for that? Because
Well, some of the things
people against
I've been involved in plans and stuff where they wanted us to do that, and one of the things that I think, because we have so many of those opportunities in Idaho, is one, now we have better examples of where we've done it. Cynthia talked about the road diet in Paris. That was done. But ITD approached Weiser about a road diet, and they kind of had the same response. One of the things we've done, and you can do it with apps and other things, but it's a floating car study. And you go out there and you drive it about 10 times in each direction, and you drive it at the prevailing speed, the way people are going, the posted speed, and desired speed, and compare the time it takes for those trips to get through, for our towns, a mile at the most. I mean, we're not like Island Park with the largest main street in the country, and really say, look, we're talking about 15 seconds of extra time. And I've found other cases where, because of signal timing patterns and other things, it ended up being such a small incremental thing. That's one. I think the other side is to also talk to communities about stuff like curb extensions that reduce the width, where you can put in median islands. And those are things that we have real policy barriers to in Idaho, because what we do and don't allow the state DOT to do. But we do, and so it's not just like posting a speed limit and thinking that it's slower, but putting the real tangible stuff. We go out now because of the phones, and let's film us trying to cross this road as a pedestrian and try to get back to some of those values things is probably the best I can say. But you represent the cultural issue that is a big thing to overcome. Like I said, in the Weiser example, where ITD's, hey, we're willing to do a road diet, we want to do this, and the town is going no. So
my answer is even simpler. Do you believe in quality of life? Do the people in your city believe in quality of life? Will they profess that, and will in your comp plan it say, hey, quality of life, quality of life? Okay, then what quality of life are we reaching if we can't feel comfortable in small town Idaho to let our kids walk to school?
Well, that's we're doing our comp plan right now, too,
Yeah.
so I'm trying to get that into there.
Yeah.
To be fair, on the Norfino slide, that was my school that I went to.
you're a maniac?
I grew up, I'm a maniac, Yeah. So
We've
that
heard.
is a society issue. That's the high school.
Yep.
The elementary school is cited nicely in the downtown with that. Hill has been like that forever.
Yeah.
And there were kids, I graduated in '86, so it was a long time ago. Kids were walking up that hill, speeding up the hill. It's cited far enough out of town that you are forced to drive, forced to take the bus. No one walks there because it's up a hill, out of town. There's no subdivisions
Yeah.
around that. And
But what wasn't there when you were going to school? That pathway in the health department, which is signs that things
department's
are
always been
changing.
there.
Well, when I went up there, it was, I think I don't know, maybe they remodeled the heck out of it or added to it, but
there
they
used
were,
to be a laundromat
yeah,
where the bus
yeah.
barn is.
yeah.
Yeah, the school siding and the land use piece create some purposeful disconnects in those that I think we're working on a project with United Way of Southwest Idaho to look specifically at school siding and life cycle cost in school siding that gets at some of those, especially the transportation issues. And we're incentivized the wrong way. The state pays for school busing. We subsidize that, and so our school districts have no incentive to think about those locations in a deeper way. We're starting to get there. Boise School District has a couple of good examples, but there's a new high school north of Nampa that you can fit the entire Pentagon and its parking complex into the site of an Idaho high school.
The last part about that is an argument that I'm on Facebook right now about speed.
Really?
School zone speed cameras and the entrapment or the police state that a school zone speed camera creates. And there's a failure for, I think, the larger community to understand that we do need enforcement in school zones. And it may be a camera because you could put in all the holdouts, hawks, RRFPs, or whatever you want to. People are still blowing through those school zones. And there's no solution coming from, these people are, some of them are engineers, traffic engineers. And it's sort of like, oh, I'm wringing my hands and I don't know what to do. And I disagree with everything that's happening, that we won't put school or cameras in
Yeah.
school zones to do speed.
And I think it goes back to that safe system approach. I think where my daughter crosses every day, the crossing guard's like, I have at least 2 cars a week that blow through the red light there. And I think we, need to change the conversation. Instead of calling them speed cameras, make them safety cameras and think about their deployment and not, I was in one back where I used to live and they said, well, one of the reasons the city didn't want to do the safety cameras was because, well, they'd have to put it out to a private company and they weren't sure about the profits going to the private company. I'm going, well, you're just playing into the game that this is a revenue generator. It shouldn't matter if the goal is safety. If you have to lease it out to a private company to manage it, then so be it. Our goal is quality of life and safety. So again, back to culture, to change that conversation in a big way.
Yeah.
Well, we'll stick around for other questions. You guys have until about 2:10 for the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.